There's been lots of conversation about what might be taking place between Iran and the United States, whether it's threats to bomb the Straits of Hormuz or to close it, or whether it's some exchange of letters. Tell me what you think might be going on there.
I think all of that is going on, in fact. There are threats, there are concerns, and there are divisions within the Israeli government, within the Iranian government, within the U.S. government. That is to say, divisions in our government, not of principle, but of uncertainty, how to play it. In effect, things are coming to a head, and I think we have to take a deep breath. And while I think we're engaged in the right course of trying to somehow or other redress the problem posed by Iran, we have to be very careful not to create a situation in which the Iranians feel they're being destroyed by the sanctions, and they lash out and start a conflict.
And you just had the European Union states say that they will enforce all sanctions.
That's right. Now the question is, how far does one go in these sanctions? Because if, in effect, a country is about to be destroyed economically, it first of all unites the people with the government. The people, generally speaking, don't react against the government until there is a defeat. Till then, they feel the other side is at fault. So we run the risk, in any case, of uniting the Iranians, the people, with the government.
Does sanctions have the power to force them, to compel them to do something and change their behavior on the nuclear issue?
That depends a great deal on how we pose that issue. Because if the issue is posed in a way in which they have to, in effect, abjectly capitulate, then I think a great many of them will say no. This is a country of 80 million people. And they know that while we can inflict enormous damage on them, they can hurt us a lot. Charlie, we have been now in 2 10-year-long wars. We have wasted an enormous amount of financial wealth, not to speak of lives. Our position in the world has deteriorated. Can you imagine what the consequences would be for us if the conflict in Afghanistan expanded because of the Iranians, if Iraq was massively destabilized, if Bahrain was set on fire, if the northeastern oil fields in Saudi Arabia were attacked?
Do they have the capacity to ignite all of that?
To ignite, yes. To prevail, no. But in the meantime, the consequences, the costs, would be cumulative.
And oil prices would go through the roof.
Yes, and the global economy will be affected. So we're playing with fire here. I understand our commitment of dealing resolutely with this problem. I'm a little baffled why we're pushing the envelope so hard, because after all, we have been willing to live with North Korea, which demonstrably poses a similar problem for South Korea and for Japan, yet we're not making such a fuss. We have been able to deter the Soviet Union, which was much more lethal than Iran can ever be in the foreseeable future. We deterred the Chinese, even though Mao Zedong said that a nuclear war would mean 300 million people dead, so what? You know, we have to take a deep breath and ask ourselves, look, if worst comes to worst, and even if they do move towards having some capacity in the nuclear weapons area, we can still deter them. We can certainly destroy them.
Is it your opinion they only want capacity, they don't want necessarily to produce weapons?
I think it's open, and I suspect they're positioning themselves to be a little bit like Japan.
Exactly.
That is to say, have the potential capacity, but not to exercise it. Well, in that context, is that worse than a war, or is it less lethal than a war?
And can you make an argument for that? Because some people say the worst outcome is not that they would use the nuclear weapon against Israel or anyone else. The possibility that it is a land in which the nuclear weapon, if it was made, could be stolen.
They have to be handled with TLC, tender loving care. Because if you don't know how to use them, if you don't know how to adjust them, if you don't revitalize them periodically, and I'm using layman's language deliberately, they become either useless or dangerous to the people who are playing with them.
Does that include our own stockpile?
Certainly. That's why we do all sorts of things to it periodically, to keep it, so to speak, ready and refreshed and reliable and all that. The notion that the Iranians, after spending years and years of capital and effort and making major sacrifices from their standpoint, would give it to Hezbollah or to Hamas is laughable.
Okay, now I don't think they would do that because it would rain down on them rather than Hezbollah, because you can't find Hezbollah there in Lebanon and other places.
And they can be traced. You know, nuclear forensics now enable us to more or less tell if there is an explosion. What was the point of origin?
But so therefore you dismiss the idea that they're likely to be stolen, number one. And you also seem to accept the idea that a nuclear Iran can be contained as a nuclear North Korea has been contained, as the Soviet Union was contained.
Yes, I do.
So therefore it's okay with you if they achieve nuclear capability.
No, it's not okay.
I don't find a better way.
No, it's not okay because there are negatives. First of all, it creates instability. It heightens a sense of insecurity in Israel. It propitiates nuclear proliferation because some of the Arab states may want nuclear weapons. So it creates an international problem. But it's an international problem which I think has to be addressed with a sense of delicacy and responsibility, patience, and determination. And we have the power to deter. We have the power to destroy them if need be. But we don't need to rush headlong into a confrontation, which I fear will not erupt because someone starts it deliberately. Not even the Israelis, but is more likely to erupt because there will be such a level of fear and insecurity on both sides that some incidents or mistakes will precipitate an explosion.
But the argument also goes that as long as there is delay and delay and delay, for whatever reason, in getting the problem solved, they're closer to the success that they want.
Conceivably, but then you have to ask yourself, is containing them preferable to starting a war in which we, the United States, will be the principal payers of costs? You know, it is not an accident that Russia is not anxious to get involved, nor for that matter the Chinese. They have been looking at us over the last 20 years, watching us shooting ourselves in the foot, declining as a major power, waging wars which we are not prepared to win or capable of winning, or in which we set too high a goal. And are we going to compound these errors? Why?
So what would you do?
I would do more or less what we have been doing,
sanctions?
But with a sense of
and sanctions on oil?
No, I wouldn't force it to the point in which the choice for them is capitulation or collision. And if we're going to bring them to their knees, I think we're going to precipitate an explosion.
Is there any doubt in your mind that they want a nuclear capability?
I think they want to have a potential capability. They also want to have status. They live in a part of the world in which, to the left of them, the Pakistanis have weapons. To the right of them, the Israelis have weapons. And there is an interesting problem also with the Pakistanis and Israelis. There's an interesting problem with the Israeli nuclear weapons. The Israelis have them, presumably, to defend themselves, right? Including against the Iranians, right?
Right.
Okay, now it seems that the Israelis feel that their nuclear deterrent doesn't deter the Iranians, right? And then maybe they should offer to give it up if the Iranians give theirs up. If it's useless, why have it? And I'm opposing this essentially as an argument because I know it won't be taken seriously. But the point is that we're dealing here with a volatile problem which involves a series of countries. But if there is an eruption, we will be the ones who will be making the sacrifices, entail the costs, and suffer the consequences.
Is it likely the Israelis would strike, in your judgment, even though Ehud Barak said it was not imminent, it was a long way off? And if they made that decision, would they inform the United States? What would they do?
My guess is if they were going to strike, they would strike on their own without giving us much of an advance warning, maybe just as the operation begins. And its primary strategic objective would not be the achievement of the destruction of Iranian nuclear capabilities, because they know they cannot do that effectively. But the objective would be to precipitate an Iranian reaction against us, because our complicity would be apparent to the Iranians in the sense that we didn't do anything to prevent it from happening, and that we, in fact, armed the Israelis so that they could do it. So their reaction would be directed against us. We would be the obvious target. And this is where the Strait of Hormuz, and Bahrain and Iraq and Afghanistan and the price of oil and the condition of the global economy comes into play.
You think anything is going on with respect to the Israelis and the Palestinians? You see the effort on the part of the Palestinians to talk to the other part. Fatah talks to Hamas. You think there's any possibility that somehow they may speak with one voice and therefore be able to negotiate with the Israelis?
I have been dealing with this problem for 30 years, and I have a very simple conclusion based on my experience. And it's not a condemnation of one or the other. The fact of the matter is, in my judgment, that left to their own resources, the Israelis and the Palestinians will never reach a fair settlement, one that they can both live with. The publics on both sides are predisposed to some sort of a fair settlement, but there's these obstacles and these differences of what is fair.
Faction within faction in each state.
The bottom line is the Palestinians are too weak to make serious compromises as the beginning of the negotiating process. The Israelis are too strong and also too interested in having more land to make the initial compromises. It takes a third party to promote a settlement. There's only one party that can do that. That's the United States.
Which brings me to my next question before we turn to the book. How do you assess the stewardship in foreign policy of President Obama?
If I were to assess it abstractly, I could raise some objections. If I were to assess it in comparison to the alternatives that I see and hear every week, I think he's doing much better than any of the alternatives.
Fair enough, I hear that. But let's treat it in isolation as to what might have been. Okay.
Well, I think what might have been is, after his speeches in Istanbul, in Cairo, after his commitment to getting the peace, he might have chosen to go even on a historic and heroic visit to Jerusalem, made one more speech, and then really put the pressure on both the Palestinians and the Israelis to compromise. I think he positioned himself as moving towards peace. He even said the construction of the settlements ought to be stopped. When Netanyahu defied him, he got away with it. When the U.S. Congress began to pile in on Obama, not to mention all of the other problems that he was facing, the financial, the economic, and all of that, he decided to postpone it, which means he lost momentum, because he had most momentum in the first year, and he lost some credibility. It's still regainable for the sake of the people involved, because in all of this discussion, there's a tendency to look at it from both sides, the Palestinian and the Israeli, from the short-range perspective. What do we get? What do we extract from the other? How do we position ourselves? What both sides forget is that if there is no peace, it means a horrible fate for the Palestinians in the near future, and an extremely dangerous fate for Israel in the longer run, as American power recedes from the Middle East. Because what we have to observe is the fact that we were paramount in the Middle East after World War II, and we stayed paramount until recently. At one point, we had good relations with the key players in the Middle East: Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Look where we're now. We don't have particularly good relations with Iran, which we've just talked about. The Saudis are kind of uneasy about, especially because of Mubarak and Egypt.
Yeah, but they seem to have come back strong, it seems to me, a
Well,
little
they've
bit.
come back with a sense of hesitation and reservation.
Right, exactly.
They don't trust us anymore. They don't rely on us. And the Egyptians are in a very unpredictable phase. So the whole structure of power in the Middle East is changing, and none of it is changing to our advantage.
And who becomes the key player?
Whoever dominates. And that could be very messy. Or whoever solicits new friends. That could, over time, even be China. Or in the shorter run, Pakistanis or Indians providing, for example, troops for hire to some of the countries.